Greetings, citizens of the Crown States of America, and welcome to Grasping TWIG, a critical podcast where we dissect Wildbow's third and perhaps best web serial, brought to you thanks to the uncanny technology of echo transmissions, the latest invention of our dear academies. This is your host, Fib Industries, and with me is my co-host, Sigma.
Hi, I'm Sigma, and as Fib just told you, I'm your co-host for today.
This podcast is very much on the same vein as other shows such as We Got Warm and Deep Impact, with a few special exceptions. For starters, we both already read TWIG in its entirety, and with that in mind, the analysis that we're going to make is going to be a lot more focused on re-examining the meaning of the story with the full picture in mind.
This is a story I'm a big fan of, and I would really like to take a second look at it, see what you can see on a second read, or a more critical read, if you will.
Right, like, we will be able to point out bits of foreshadowing as they are happening, instead of being all coy and being like, ooh, what made this happen? Or like, we'll get to examine the characters much more informed by what we already know, by having the full picture. Like, instead of being like, oh, why is this character doing this, or why is this character acting this way? Now we know, so we get to go into that. Before we start, I want to talk about our position on this web serial in the context of the rest of Wildbow's production, specifically the claim I made at the beginning, which some may find a little controversial. Would you say that TWIG is the best, quote-unquote, web serial done by Wildbow?
I don't think I would, no. I think it's a clear second best, but I'm going to go with the rather uncontroversial position that Worm is the best web serial that Wildbow has written so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the most popular. I don't know, I feel like in TWIG he got a little more chances to... he had more time to like find, to perfect his craft, to like really get a little more experience, though there are some major problems with TWIG, especially at the beginning, what with the episodic format and some other stuff here and there. With all that out of the way, let's begin on the first chapter, Taking Root, 1.1.
The first lesson, something even the uninitiated know. For life to flourish on the most basic level, it requires 4 elements: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen.
I really like this first line because if you pay attention to your biology in high school, those are like the first 4 elements that make up DNA, with the inclusion of phosphorus, but for whatever reason he didn't include it.
The reason is fairly obvious, of course, is that it's drawing an analogy to the 4 classical elements, but, instead of saying, oh, the 4 elements that make things are fire and water and so on, it's take a twist, talks about biology.
Oh, I didn't say it that way. That's actually really clever. And also, it helps understand, like, with that in mind, knowing that these are the elements of the DNA, it also helps you understand that these people have actually quite an advanced understanding of biology, of chemical biology. Like, when did we find out in our timeline the basic elements of DNA?
Not the same time they did. I wouldn't give you a year with any confidence.
Yeah, because if you read the blurb that Wildbow wrote as like an excerpt for you to like a preview of the story, like an introduction of the story, it says it's been 200 years since a genius discovered the secrets of life. So it's implied like they have been knowing this. They knew, they had like complete understanding of DNA by the 1700s, which is incredible. Something that I wanted to talk actually before we even start with the story is that TWIG has something that not any other web serial by Wildbow has, which is really interesting, which is the banners. First of all, they are like actually commissioned images by artists, not like stock photos slightly edited, and they actually change throughout the story. And I think this is actually really interesting.
It's some rather excellent artwork. I think it does add a lot to the story, and I don't know. I've never really paid much attention to when you see each banner, but they do in fact change over time.
Yeah, and in fact, like they change whenever they changed, they included something new that was added to the group that the other images before didn't have. Like at one point I think they had Mary, and then another point they had Ashton, things like that. But like it's actually really helpful because the first banner in the story is literally the first scene in the story, right? Well, not technically the first scene, but it's like the four original members of the group walking across the street, and you actually see like the meat hanging from the trees, and like that really immediately helps set the mood and the atmosphere for the story. So we see our characters staking a barn in the outskirts of the city, and at first we don't know why, and that's something that wildbow loves to do all the time, which is, you know, as the scene progresses, it slowly introduces more and more elements that let you put together a more complex image.
Yeah, in fact, actually, Sai actually lies about what they're doing. Our first hint of what they're doing there is a lie that Sai is telling Tom.
Really?
Yeah, he says like the Academy pays them to look at stuff, which is not really true. They work for the Academy, but they aren't orphans who get some pocket money from it. They are experiments. We already know that.
And it's actually like through the narrative, through the way the characters react to the way Sai talks, it's already made clear early on that Sai is a liar, which is a very important thing to get to understand of him right away.
Yeah, it's true. It's that Sai is a liar, and that Sai is kind of a very confrontational jerk. Basically, it's kind of two things you need to understand about him as a person of all, and this chapter does introduce them very quickly.
Yeah, and it also introduces like all of the relationships between the characters, like that first moment where Lillian says, I want Sai to go first up the stairs because otherwise he's gonna pick down my skirt. Like that immediately lets you know everything about these two characters and how these two characters fit in the context of the group. And there are a bunch of other subtle little details here and there, like Helen barely talks throughout this chapter except for the last line, and we're gonna get to that. The fact that Gordon clearly comes across as the leader. Like, he's the one who's constantly regulating the interactions between the other characters.
Yeah, and in fact, the thing about Sai's and Lillian's relationship is, at this point, Lil is very new. That's part of Sai's narration, that he doesn't trust her, she's new, but their interactions more or less keep the same tone in different ways throughout the story, even when they're the closest friends they can possibly, and further on.
Right. And, like, it's almost funny, because when I read this for the first time, it brought me back to, like, the first chapters of Harry Potter, where you see Ron and Hermione bickering all the time, and your first reaction is, oh, they are gonna end up together. And that was basically my reaction here. Like, oh yeah, these two are gonna end up together. Which, it doesn't happen quite like that, but...
You wouldn't be totally wrong to think that.
Yeah, exactly. So, another thing that I really like is the fact that, because the first time I read this, I was a little confused about the setting in a way, because I actually hadn't really bothered reading all that much. I didn't actually bother reading Wildbow's introduction before starting to read this chapter, so I was slowly piecing together that, like, the setting, the fact that it mentions a barn, and a barn is a very old thing, and a barn is not something someone comes across very often nowadays, at least not in the cities. And the way they talk, the language they use, like, they're all very subtle indications that this is actually, quote-unquote, a period piece. Like, it's happening, like, in the past, but not quite.
Yeah, exactly. And, of course, if you actually do read the blurb, you know it's, like, 100 years ago or so, but that's actually harder to piece together, because some of the most obvious hints for someone from our context to tell where something is in time is, technological level, and the mechanical technological level of TWIG is actually behind what would have been in the first 1920s, but of course the biological science is something impossible for us. It's way, way beyond us.
Yes. I guess that gives us a chance to discuss the fact that this is biopunk, as opposed to, say, cyberpunk or steampunk. This is a setting where biological progress is the key factor of science and society in this world. Which is interesting, because the thing is, it's not a very this is not a very common genre, at least not like in the mainstream fiction that people consume nowadays. Nowadays, a lot, like cyberpunk, everyone knows cyberpunk. Superheroes, everyone knows superheroes. Magic with Pact, like everyone knows magic. Biopunk is not as common, so it's interesting that wildbow decided to go to this, and I guess it's a way for him to like experiment with the genre. Like he had a little bit of help when it come to working with superheroes or working with magic, because these are things that are well established in the collective consciousness. But when he actually decides to do biopunk, he's working with something that people are not actually that used to. So I think he took this as a chance to experiment a little bit more beyond not only his comfort zone, but the comfort zone of his readers.
Yeah, that's true. And I think Biopunk really plays to one of Wildbow's strengths, so to speak, which is that Wildbow really loves body horror. Like,
oh yeah,
that happens in literally every serial all the time, and Twig is a body horror universe.
It's body horror all throughout. Yeah, really, and it's incredible. Yeah, that's something I didn't thought about. So we see them sneak around the barn. They get to see the monster for the first time, and it's a really nice description. It's like this lizard that is, well, it's a mixture between a snake and a lizard, in the sense that it has the completely seamless body of a snake, but with legs.
It's a very terrifying look at first, you know. You're seeing, you know, a monster in a hayloft with 4 kids who can't really avoid it.
Right, and at this point we don't know everything about these kids, so we don't know how capable they are. We don't know that actually this creature is in more danger in their presence than they're in the presence of the creature, but we don't know that yet, so it is thrilling. So they come out the other side of the barn and they meet the last member to introduce of this group, which is Jamie, aka the best goddamn character in the entire story.
Yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with you. You could probably guess that I love Jamie.
In the next chapter, we're gonna see a couple of indications about the characterization of Jamie that we're gonna get on. But for now, Jamie is just a quiet geek, and like he is with this other kid, this Afro-American kid, and they're being like scouting the place. And Sai does some trickery with the kid. Like he tells him, "Hey, I want you to go to this place and drop this bucket of water over this thing." And at first we all may thinking, okay, this is part of the plan, this is part of how they're gonna deal with the monster, whatever, but the other members of the group are just as confused and distrustful of Sai, and this doesn't come up yet in this chapter, so that's actually interesting.
Yeah, it's the first tricky Sai plan we've ever seen, which is, you know, it's kind of his trademark. And we see the payoff relatively soon, you know, next chapter, but we do see a payoff. We do have to wait for it.
Yeah, which it's a nice thing that wildbow does. It's like he always has all of these spinning plates and all of these setups and payoffs that come asynchronous in a way, which it is this braided format of storytelling, which it's always keeping many threads going at different speeds and different rhythms. So they keep examining the place. They investigate the papers of the guy who created this monster, and the guy shows up, and we have a long confrontation that we're not gonna go into here, but like they managed to corner the guy, and the guy starts to create excuses for himself. Like they confront him with the fact that this creature that he created has not only been eating, you know, animals, stray cats, but it has actually been eating people. And like the guy is trying to excuse himself.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm not actually super sure we should trust the lambs that the snake charmer's pet has actually eaten a person, or this is just psychological warfare, but it is technically possible it's possible that it happened, I guess.
Yeah, and that's, well, again, another trademark of wildbow. He likes to keep things, these little details here, ambiguous, because they make the story a little more rich. Though, I mean, I guess at this point we don't really quite have a reason to doubt the lambs. again, I guess that's the opportunity that rereading the story with the full picture in mind brings us. Like, now we know, hey, they might have been just lying to the guy to get to him.
Yeah, they would say the same thing either way,
Right, right. So the guys start explaining, and this is a fantastic bit of exposition about the world. Like, this is where the first big aspect of world building comes in, where he starts explaining about the academies. And not only the fact that, the academies exist, but how they operate and how they're kind of ruthless, right? How they are, like, constantly pressuring people to, like, go above and beyond, and how some people break under this. And we start to get the image of this group of kids as, like, this specialized group that is dedicated to investigating deviations, people who go outside the system and they capture them.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that's interesting is the first look we get at the Twig universe is in the previews that wildbow wrote a long time ago, and that those go a lot more detail on the kind of person who breaks down and leaves the academies. We get our first look at Frey through those previews, and if you have that context in mind, you might start it out who to trust at this point. But if you don't, if you're just reading the serial for the first time without that context, which most people didn't have, well, you have a guy with a monster who's eating people and saying, well, school was very hard.
Yeah. So I think I should clarify for the listeners. I think that wildbow did after finishing Worm was that he gave the readers a bunch of different samples of different stories that he might be interested in writing. One of those samples happened in the universe of Twig. Back then it was called Boyle, and it was from the point of view of another character that we are actually going to see way down the line in this story, called Frey. And the thing is that, that story was actually focused from the point of view of the underdog. It was from the point of view of someone who would resent the academy, who would resent the system, and who would try to escape the system and go their own way. In this story, which is actually really interesting from wildbow as a writer, is the fact that he's writing from the point of view of the establishment. He is writing from the point of view of those who hold power and maintain the status quo, which is really new for wildbow in this web serial, because he almost always wrote about the underdogs, about the people who were in a really desperate situation, who are desperate to find any meager scraps of power that they could get. Taylor was a supervillain. Blake was, a diabolist that everyone hated. And so it's interesting that this time he decided to tell it from the point of view of the establishment.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he does have a lot of strengths in writing someone who is desperate, and that probably helps in terms that, well, the Lambs are kids. They go up as kids against really big monsters and scientists and other things, even when they are on the academy side.
Right, yeah, actually, that keeps it balanced, I guess, the fact that they are kids. Except that also is actually put into question as the story goes on, because we start to realize they're actually more than just kids, and they are actually a lot more capable than we could give them credit at first. But anyway, so through trickery and strength and deceit, or well, through just what's the word? Talent, I guess. They managed to outsmart the guy, this evil scientist, the snake charmer, as they call them. By the way, I really love the detail that how they insist on calling him the snake charmer, even though he says, "Oh, that's not my name. That's not my name," and how they're constantly subtly dehumanizing him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the nicknames they give their opponents are a constant theme throughout the story. The competition to see who gets to nickname their next opponent is very fun.
Yeah, and the thing is that the names that they gave are very reminiscent of the kind of names that villains would get in the old serial stories of the 20s. We have the Snake Charmer, or the what was the other names? The Bat Seed, the Red Priest, I guess, was Mauer.
He had a priest name, I forget the one. The Shepherd, I guess.
The Shepherd, yeah, right. So yeah, it's all of these. They're all of these very old timey names. They're old timey supervillain names in a way because it was from before the concept of supervillains even existed. These are not names like the I know the Super Snake Man or something like that. So after they defeat the guy by getting rid of the pheromones and chemicals that he was using to keep the monster away from himself, and they wound him pretty badly so that his blood actually entices the monster to kill him. And the thing is that the guy tries to reach for his chemicals on his lab so he can scare the monster away, and Gordon makes a very deliberate effort of, like, he very deliberately keeps it away from the guy. Like, it almost goes to the point of kicking him while he's down. And that is, like, the first indication of truly how inhumane the lambs are, how truly ruthless they are.
Yeah, because, I mean, Gordon would have mercy killed him at that point, you know? He made him bleed precisely so his pet, I think, would eat him. That's not mercy, that's, you know, ruthlessness.
Yeah, right. Like, it's almost argued, like... And later they are going to ask them... I think Haley asks them later, well, did you capture him alive or dead? And he was like, oh, he died. What can you do, right? But, like, it's very obvious that they wanted to kill the guy. Like, it's not like, oh, we couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, maybe they could have, maybe they didn't, but it's obvious they didn't try, you know? That wasn't a goal they had.
Right. So, okay, the guy ends up being eaten by the monster, and we have, the chapter ends with the first phrase, I think. Well, no, actually, it's not quite the first, but the first full sentence said by the second best character in the entire story, Helen, who says,
"The Academy sends its regards, Mr. Snake Charmer."
And the fact that she's been so quiet, and she's been described as this really nice, prim, beautiful, proper young lady, and that she has this little cutesy salute at the end, right? It's like, that immediately, you don't need to know everything about Helen yet, but this is already telling you a lot about her, like...
Yeah, exactly. It's the same with Sai and Jamie and Gordon and Lily, you know? You're just getting the basic picture, and then we fill out the details later, of course, but we're getting a very good idea of who these people are.
Right. So we get to see, the next chapter begins, and we get to see Lillian taking care of Sai with a couple of powders. I love the fact that they explain, oh, she just sprayed me with a couple of non-specific powders, and now I'm perfectly fine. Which, already another indication of how progress medicine is in this world. And we start to see how Jamie is fussing all over Sai and getting all worried and bothered and concerned about Sai's well-being. And Sai, like a blind idiot, does not notice anything weird about it, but we know.
Yeah, we know.
So, okay, we see the guys walking back to the orphanage. We get a more proper and more thorough description of the world. Like, we start to see the Stitch horses, like horses that were brought back from the dead, and how common they are. How, like, 1 in 10 horses were actually alive, whereas the other are all staged. It describes how the city is constantly under artificial rain. It describes... We have this conversation with this woman who is like, oh, I could give you some proper lessons about how to be a young lady to Helen and stuff like that. And that already gives us a more full picture of this world.
Yeah, exactly. And to Gordon as well, you know, you get the idea that Helen and Gordon are the nice, presentable face of the team, despite what they are underneath. And, you know, Sai is obviously Sai, he's a jerk, he's the kind of person who tricks both his friends and his enemies. And Jamie is quieter, and so on.
Exactly. So we get to the orphanage, and we are introduced to the woman who runs the orphanage, but more importantly, we are introduced to Hailey, who... Has it been explained yet? I mean, it's not quite literally explained, this is the guy who created me, but Sai does say that, you know, he's like a father to me.
I think it Haley does say something like, I made you, or something like that, during their conversation in the carriage by the end.
Right. So, Hailey asks them about how the mission went. They tell them, well, we dealt with it, with the snake charmer. And Hailey sees that Sai is actually badly wounded, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna take you back to my lab or the academy so I can, stitch you up completely, and I want a report specifically from you. And the thing is, this is when we start to see a couple of dominoes fall, because during the fight, Sylvester actually almost kind of goes out of his way to get hurt, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is something I didn't notice until this reread, actually, that Sylvester's fall was very deliberately a part of this plan.
Yeah. So they take him down the carriage, and then while they are in their way to the academy, the barrel full of water falls on top of the stitched horses, and now everything comes full circle. We see, this was Sylvester's plan. And the fact that it didn't pay off in the very same chapter, but actually a chapter afterwards, it already gives us an indication of how capable Sai is of forecasting, of setting up things so that they come just the way he wants it, very, very in advance. Because if it had been in the very same chapter, we'd all that been okay, yeah, this was all set up and resolved right in this moment. But by putting the distance of an entire chapter in the middle, it puts emphasis on how forward-looking Sai is.
Yeah, exactly. And, wildbow explains, tells us that Tom needs to throw the barrel of water, and he explains shortly at the start of the chapter, that water is in fact a problem for stitched horses. This all comes together very neatly, and it's a very good example of a thing that will keep on happening,
Right. I love that they use the word voltaic horses. They don't use electric horses. No, they use voltaic horses.
Yeah, because electricity is weird. You have voltaic piles. It's odd. It's old. It's not a thing everyone would have in their house. It gives you an idea of the role of electricity in their world, ultimately.
Exactly. So Sai clearly, as the scene progresses, we get to see that Sylvester did all of this deliberately so he could be left alone with the files, but he still has to deal with the guard in the carriage, who is going to keep the files away from Sylvester, and it immediately tells us he's stitched. And the way that Sylvester tries to deal with the guy is by setting a match on fire and putting the fire on front of the guy. And I really love this small little detail, that their first reaction to fire originally, the first reaction of the stitched to fire, was abject terror and complete, they lose their mind. Because again, that's another little callback to the very few tropes from biopunk that we are familiar with, that characters like Frankenstein were incredibly afraid of fire and stuff like that, or fire made them go crazy. And I love all of these little tropes that are informed by old-timey biopunk.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the next thing that happens is that the stitched guard doesn't actually react that way. He stays quiet. So it's not only he's incorporating these tropes, he's already subverting them.
And of course, we do keep seeing Stitch all throughout the story, and it would be kind of boring if you could just strike a match and paralyze them, So you're building up the idea that weaknesses are not permanent. They can be patched. They can be worked around.
Yes, of course. The first thing that scientists will try to do is to fix that problem.
Yeah, well, it's not the Stitch welfare they're going to care about, of course.
Another thing that I want to point out is the fact that their first fix that they could think of was freeze the Stitched, right? But that doesn't actually fix the problem of the Stitched being scared of fire. So that actually brings up a whole new level of hell onto this experience. He's scared out of his mind, but he can't do anything about it because all of his muscles are paralyzed. So in a way, it's even worse. That's another indication of the quiet the constant sense of horror and both body horror and psychological horror that permeate this entire world. So yeah, after that, Sai gets to read the files, and Hailey comes and he sees him, and like Hailey's like, why didn't you just ask? And Sai was like, because you could have said no, and then you would have known that I wanted the files, so I thought this was the best way. And that, again, that gives us another indication of the way Sai thinks, which is like, he won't go for the straight, direct, honest approach. He will always try the circuitous, sneaky path first.
He doesn't trust people. He doesn't trust Hailey to tell him things. So he knows if he wants to manipulate Hailey, he has to give him the least information possible.
Right. So then Hailey actually allows him to read the files, and what he wanted to see, we find out as the last line of this chapter, is expiration dates. And I love the idea of expiration dates, and I love the idea that this first chapter finishes, because it already, like, the best way to introduce tension to any scene, to any situation, is add a ticking clock. And like, introducing this element already gives us like an entire story spanning ticking clock. And I love that, because right as I finished reading that the first time, I immediately realized, okay, this is what the story is gonna be about. It's about the slow and tortuous and painful decay of these characters. Like, I already, like, the possibilities for drama are already there and ripe.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, another thing we find out explicitly at that point is that, well, Gordon and Jamie and Sai and Helen are specific experiments. You know, they have project names. They have. You could still have thought that Sai was just an annoying kid, but no, you know, he's a project. He's something a scientist is working on.
And the whole talking about, you know, staged and Frankenstein monsters and like custom made monsters like the snake, it already puts us into the mind of, okay, how different are these characters? Like, quite how monstrous are they? Are they like completely stitched? Are they like genetic creations made from scratch? What powers do they have? What abilities do they have? Like, we starting to get already some signs that, okay, Sai is clearly the smart one, Gordon is like the strong one. We don't really know what Jamie does yet. We don't really know what Helen can do yet. But we are given one more clue, which is the code names for their for each project, which are
Galatea, Griffin, Caterpillar, and Wyvern, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and already, like, we already can glimpse so much information from these names, right? Like, first, let's start with Gordon. Griffin, like, if you see mythology, a griffin is a mythological creature which is composed by an eagle and the front part of an eagle and the backside of a lion. And like, this creature is like, it's composed by two very noble beasts, very noble regal beasts. The eagle, which is the sign of America, and the lion, which is like the king of the jungle. And that already gives us an indication about how Gordon, this they actually very explicitly say afterwards, Gordon was made from the best bits of everyone.
Yeah, exactly. We have both the idea of bravery, of nobility, which is what the griffin symbolizes, but also that Gordon is made of disparate pieces, which is a common theme in mythology, but it's not something you see in the other code names.
Right. Then we have Galatea, and I find Galatea actually incredibly delightful on hindsight, because the mythology of Galatea is that there was this Greek sculptor who was sculpting a beautiful woman, and suddenly the woman comes to life, and like they kiss and they start a relationship. He immediately falls in love with her. And like, we don't know who Ivat is. We haven't heard the name Ivat, but like, this already gives us an indication why Helen was created in the first place, right?
Yeah, exactly. We have, and I think that's the most informative of all the project names, in my opinion, that because the others, we know, they're animals, they're myths, they're general ideas, but Galatea is a story. You know, she's an artificial woman created by someone, a sort of ideal woman, which is something we also see early in the chapter. You know, her as a proper young lady. I think that's the most. It gives you a very clear idea of what's gonna happen to Helen, what her creator had in mind, in fact.
Yeah, yeah. Then we have Chrysalis, which actually I think is like the more obscure of the names. Like, we're gonna get to Wyvern. I actually have some ideas about what Wyvern means, but Chrysalis actually kind of stumped me for a while. What would you say is the relationship between Jamie as a character and Chrysalis?
Well, the obvious idea, of course, is that Chrysalis is this a stage between two things. One as we know eventually, but of course we don't know yet, is that Jamie will stop being Jamie and become, Jesse, Jamie 2.0.
Oh yeah, actually, but like, I think that's a very good indication symbolically for the readers, like in the context of the narrative. But my wonder is, why would the scientist call Jamie Chrysalis? Because I don't think they had in mind,
Yeah, obviously they knew it was something that could happen, but obviously it wasn't the goal, or it wasn't the end state of the project. It was,
Right.
And I think the other idea you can think from the scientist's point of view is that, Jamie's a caterpillar, and the whole project, the machine he's locked into, they locked around him as a chrysalis. That could be the namesake for the project, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's actually a really good way of putting it. And then finally we have Wyvern. And I mean, like, Wyvern at first is not very clear, in the sense that Wyvern is a kind of dragon with only 4 extremities, 2 legs and 2 wings. And at first you're like, okay, that doesn't really like map to Psy, at least not yet. But then I was investigating the etymology of Wyvern, and it comes from viper, which is like specifically a poisonous snake. And that gets a lot more clear. That's a much more direct reference to Psy as a person. Like, he's a liar, he's a cheat, he's poisonous, he's toxic, both in the literal sense that his blood is actually incredibly poisonous if an animal bites him, and he's incredibly resistant to poisons, and he's a snake as a person. He's poisonous and toxic as a person.
Yeah, it's definitely something I wouldn't have picked up on given the project name at first, but yeah, it makes perfect sense,
So yeah, those are basically the first 2 chapters of TWIG. And I think it's actually a pretty great, strong introduction. When I first read it for the first time, I wasn't completely into it until I got to the portion of the expiration dates, and that's when I was like, okay, there is a plan here. Like, you already know, okay, they're gonna start falling apart. How are they gonna deal with it? How is gonna come the tragedy and of it all?
It's a very overarching thread of the story, how various experiments fall apart. Like, Sai keeps falling apart throughout the story, even though he doesn't actually die of his expiration date. Jamie does, in fact, reach his expiration date and then survive it, so to speak. Gordon.
Yeah. I think that's actually hilarious. The fact that Gordon was the only one who actually completely, definitely died of his expiration date. Considering especially, like, he was, like, the best of them, or, like, he was the leader, and he's, like, the first to die, and, like, the only one to die.
Yeah, I mean, well, Jamie's kind of a special case, Jamie sort of dies, except not really, except he does.
Yeah, that's another amazing thing that we're gonna get to once we get to that chapter eventually. So, what was, like, your first reaction when you read these chapters for the first time?
It's been a while, but I think the phrase expiration dates really hit me like, okay, yeah, this is something that's gonna happen. This is a really strong way to end a chapter and to start a story, And I was very excited to be, in the world of Boyle the first time, because, not to say anything bad against Pact was great, but when the previews came around, I was actually more excited for Boyle than for Pact, even though, it was an unusual genre, I wasn't familiar with it, but it was very gripping, and I was really excited to be in that universe finally.
Yeah, I guess the thought process was that Frey was a little too similar to Taylor. Like, he was this woman who was outside of the system, and, like, who is forced to become a villain of sorts and whatever.
Yeah, Frey is definitely the Taylor of the story.
Yeah. Yeah, including the point of getting an ambiguous ending. Like, she's imprisoned, but maybe killed, but maybe not, but maybe what? Like, so that was Twig. One last thing I want to talk before we reach the end of this podcast is the naming convention for the arcs. This first arc is called Taking Root, and it's interesting how every chapter is based on a common English phrase. There's gonna be like thicker than water, or
Lamb to the Slaughter, that was very memorable.
Right, yeah, right. Oh yeah, Jesus. So, why would you think? I guess it's what would you say Wildbow chose the theme of English phrases?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to be honest. It's interesting. It's a good way to give you an idea of what might happen at any chapter. You know, it's Taking Root is a start of a story, and a story called Twig, after all. And you know, sometimes they are very good clues to what might happen. But I don't know why he chose this theme with this serial.
Well, one thing that I noticed is that almost every phrase has a biological component of some sort. Root, blood, slaughter. Like, they're all about biological functions or related to biology in some way. Another thing is that many of these common English phrases, they are from a long time ago. Like, most common phrases have like very old origins, so I guess it's another way of putting us in the mind frame of an old-timey story, of a story set in the 20s, right? And finally, I guess it's one more another interpretation you can give is like an indication of the flippant nature of Sai in general, because Sai throughout the story will insist on having this very informal narration. He will insist on having this very nonchalant way of describing the world, even though the world is filled with repulsive, monstrous things. So I guess that's another indication of that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
So yeah, that was Twig. I hope you guys liked it. We're gonna be here every what was the schedule again? Every Wednesday and Saturday at the same time that Wildbow puts out his chapters. You can support us on Patreon in Grasping Twigs, and I think that's it for today.
That's it for today. Goodbye, Twig fanatics.